With the winter 2020 ban list right around the corner, that means it's free real estate for us YouTubers.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, with the upcoming ban list around the corner for next week's livestream, it is the moment where we Vanguard tubers or Ventubers or how you want to call us start speculating around what we think or what we think should be on the new ban list. And with the other YouTubers jumping on this trend, I think it's most fitting that I also give my 2 cents about this topic. So for this video, I want to do it in 2 segments where one, I talk about what I personally think should be done, and it's gonna be a heavy one. And then at the end, I will go over what I honestly think would happen, because those are 2 complete different things than what you might expect. So first off, let's talk about my specialty, and that is Standard itself. Standard, we are currently in a very Excel heavy meta, which is slowly transitioning into a Force meta with the whole Riviere thing that honestly didn't really do a lot currently, but that's because we only had a couple of weeks of this set being released. In Japan, we saw plenty of results for Riviere, so we know what it actually can do. So with that in mind, I think there should be 4 decks in Standard that should be hit. And the first one is Tachikaze's Anger Blader. You probably have heard it by a lot of other people. This deck is pretty obnoxious to play against because if it high rolls, you die. You have basically no input in the matter of this, and you cannot do anything, and they just kill you outright, and you can start over a new game without actually doing anything. There are some outs to this if you're playing a specific deck that can high roll back without actually having the need of any resources, but most of the decks cannot do that. There are 2 ways that they can address this Anger Blader issue. Either they can errata the Anger Blader card itself, so its restand ability is similar to Gancelot and Mordred Phantom, where your opponent needs to be sitting at grade 3, which makes the deck a turn slower in the case that they high rolled and they went first, so other decks can at least have 1 extra turn to do their thing, potentially build a defensive option or go aggro themselves against them, so they can maybe force them to ditch 1 or 2 combo cards from their hand, because Anger Blader defense is pretty weak if they are forced to guard with their key pieces, which is typically the thing that should be the case with Excel decks. But another thing they can do, because I'm not sure if they're actually gonna errata cards in this type of way, because Blizzard never has done that, but then again, they never outright banned the card before, and look at Ichikishima and Ellie. But the other thing that they can do if they don't want to errata the card itself, they can make a choice restriction on Anger Blader with Sweeper Aqua Kanto, because those are the 2 problem cards together. As when they high rolled and you survived in some capacity, but they have 1 or 2 of these cards onto the board, there's nothing you can actually do. If you cannot kill them that turn, you're just staring at your own death and you know it's gonna happen. Unless you have some way to remove them without targeting them, or you can build up such a high number of attack and just ram into that rearguard. But doing that basically means you're not focusing on the Vanguard, which then gives them another turn to do their thing. Maybe a limit on having maximum of 2 Super Aqua Kantos, as limited to 1 is I think a bit too much, but limiting on 2 makes the consistency of getting those Super Aqua Kanto to hand a bit worse, especially with their gauging, where they can suddenly gauge 1 of their Aqua Kantos underneath another card. And by putting it at 2, it not outright just kills the deck, as they still got other tools to make really good numbers, to make enough gauges to do their thing, only it's less of a high roll deck where they can just outright kill your opponent when they went first, get the grid 3, and your opponent's still at grid 2, and they're like, what just happened? The other deck that I think should be hit is Pale Moon Lucriere. This is another Excel deck that does things that it shouldn't be doing, if I'm very honest. It has right consistency, it has deck filter consistency, it has high numbers with basically multi-decks because of their grade 1, but also with the excessive amount of Excel circles they can build. But on top of all of that, they have the right grade 3 consistency with insane draw power thanks to Dorian. And that is something that I think decks shouldn't have. If you're putting out an Excel deck that either is hyper aggressive or can build solid numbers, it should not have defensive options. In the way how the Silverton Lucriere deck works, it has everything that it wants, and I think it should be restricted in some kind of capacity, and it has to do with Dorian. And they can do, again, 2 things, and that is a errata or a limit. And the errata, there can be 2 things. either they just state instead of per 2 cards draw a card, it should be per 3 cards, which limits the amount of draws you can do in the early game and also limits the excessive amount of draws they can do in late game. Or they, instead of drawing, just make it counter charge. So per 2 or per 3, you countercharge 1. This means the deck will be very aggressive because they can keep using Luciere's ability, but they don't have defensive value. Which means other decks that can somewhat outlast them can either overcome their aggressive nature, or they can just rush them and the opponent won't have a good way to defend them against those things. Which makes the deck at least a bit more fair, because they won't be denied of their Luciere ability anymore thanks to the countercharging, but they aren't unbeatable because they don't have a gigantic wall where they can just hide behind. But once again, if they don't want to rot the card, they can just make a limit with Dorian together with Luciere. And I think either a limit to maximum of 2 copies of Dorian, or maybe even 1. But this makes the decks a little bit more inconsistent. They can still use the Grade 2 to fetch it out, but they are then forced to waste Counterblast on that, which makes Counterblast denying a bit more viable against the deck as a whole, because they need a 2 for Luciere. But also, it makes the amount of Dorian Luciere combos you can do a lot more restricted, because they now either have only 1 shot or 2 shot, and of course the extra shot that you have if you ride it as a Vanguard. But that means they don't have the infinite way of stalling the game like this. They need to think of when they want to resolve the Dorian. Do they want to have it in the early game as a rearguard, or do they want to have it maybe when they have 2 or 3 Axle Circles during the late game? It makes that a more skillful decision to know when to do it and when to not. Also, by restricting it to Luciere herself means if we get a different grade 3 boss monster for Silver Thorns, that could be a different version of Luciere, then Dorian can still work with that future card that might not work in the same way that Luciere does, which makes it somewhat less of an obnoxious thing to deal with. And then the third deck is yet another Axel deck, and that is Hyuga. As Hyuga has been dominating the format for quite some time, and that has to do with the same thing that why Luciere is so good. It can do everything. It can deck filter, superior call, board wipe your opponent, and even have a solid defensive tool, because with Shiryuki, they can guard against 3 attacks if they're up against an Axel deck with only 1 card. And if they're up against Agroforce, it can be potentially 6 attacks if they do it on restanders. So that is an unfair card advantage that you have to them, on top of the aggressive nature that Hyuga already possesses. So it's very clear of what the card that needs to be hit in this case, and that is Shiryuki. I think Shiryuki and Hyuga shouldn't be in the same deck. They should, just like the Nubatama restriction that we have with Jamiya Kongo and Rinne, this should be the same case for Standard with Shiryuki and Hyuga. They should not be in the same deck. Shiryuki herself on her own isn't really that much of an issue with other decks that we have with Zanpaku and that kind of cards, so I think it shouldn't be banned on their own, but with Hyuga specifically, then we got an issue. So I think those 2 cards should not be in the same build to make Hyuga a less annoyance to deal with and make Shiryuki still usable in her own right. And the final deck is what been on a lot of people's mind, and that is of course Riviere. I don't think Riviere should get a big restriction because it's not really performing as well as people thought it was, and I personally am not in the camp that it's overpowered as a lot of people thought at the time, and we're starting to see the results too that it's actually the case. However, there is some unfair nature to Riviere, just like how Anger Blader is unfair in its own aspect, and that's the high roll nature of it. And they can address this in 2 ways. Either make an errata on Riviere that its rewrite ability cannot happen until your opponent is also at grade 3, so your opponent has some more ways defense against it, because these numbers are really annoying to deal with if you're sitting at a 10k or 9k grade 2. But another thing that's been popping up in the community a lot is choice restricting Caro and Riviere to some degree. That those 2 cannot be in the same deck. And I know that people will say, but the set is just been out for 1 month, even less than a month, so it makes the stock go bad and it's a bad example. I think that argument is pretty BS, because it won't affect the value of these cards. Riviere is still a solid deck in this restriction, and Caro is still a solid card. Caro will work still in any other build. It will work in Coral, it will work in Pacifica, it will work in Eve, it will work in some kind of Highlander build, and it can work in the deck it was supposed to work for, Melody. So I don't believe that this will be bad for the stock itself, because it's not like the entire set or everything in that set would then be useless, because the set has enough other insane cards, and Riviere as a deck will still be functional but less oppressive or less high rolly or less unfair. And the reason why I think they should do these bans, because I'm a more effort person of rather banning or limiting cards to make the power level of a meta lower, so they don't have to outright power creep other cards to make it compete, as that is a bad way to do things. So I'm more of a fan of snapping the shit out of everything. But with those restrictions, I do think there is a possibility that they can unrestrict the Lizelot and Melody thing with Sonata, because the Melody deck isn't really doing all that much right now. And even if we add those restrictions in for Angerblader, Hyuga, and Riviere, I still think that Melody won't be as oppressive as it was back then, because a lot of other decks can now compete with it. Now on the premium side, it should actually be a fan of snap out of existence with the top tier decks. We should get a Yu-Gi-Oh-like restriction to make things more playable, or at least on a more playing level. I think decks like Gold Paladin with the Ezel engine should get hit. I think Gastille should get a hit. I also think the premium Riviere should get a hit. And I also think that Katrina most definitely need a hit. By hitting these top decks, they can lower the power level and make it somewhat more accessible for everybody to have a more fair game going on. Sure, by hitting the top decks, you might have unforeseen things that could happen and then pop off. But with Premium Collection 2 on the horizon, I think the best course of action is lowering the power level of the format before introducing probably more insane cards. Because if they build on top of what you already have, I think Premium is gonna be in a direction that it's gonna be unplayable for a lot of people, as they don't like the way things are going with how unfair certain decks feel right now. What kind of restrictions for these specific decks can be? It can be a whole plethora range of things. For Gold Paladin, it can be Wonder Ezel, the grade 2, it can be banned from the deck. But with that said, people then can go for the new Wonder Ezel and Bowmage for go for the Superior Ride. Is that obnoxious? I'm not really 100% sure if that's actually that bad, because without Wonder Ezel, you won't get that many Axel Circles, so your Ultima turn won't be as deadly. But they can also look at that an Ezel build might not have access to Ultima, or you can limit Spare Cross to some degree. There are a couple of ways that they can hit this. For Katrina, there are two things that they can do. They can either say Katrina is limited to one. You can only run one Katrina stride, and that could do a lot, because most games, they need a second Katrina to finish things. If we remove that second Katrina, a lot of their games, they cannot close. Or they can basically say, if you want to run Katrina in your G-Zone, you cannot run the Ember Clone Turia grade 2 in your main deck. Just like the restriction that we had with Jamio, Kongo, and Rin. It could also be a thing, so they limit the amount of attacks they can do. But with the future support on the horizon, we don't know what kind of crazy interactions they can do with Katrina. So it depends on what Bushrod already has in the pipelines, what type of restriction they think seems fit. A Gastille and NOK restriction might be the way to go, where you cannot put one in the deck with the other. But then you still have Master 5th, but Master 5th is a bit more restrictive, and if you do not kill your opponent, then you can outright win the game, because they just wasted all their soul on their cards and whatever. So it makes the deck a bit more risque. They can also just state Gastille is banned, just like they did with Ishikishima, which isn't that unthinkable, because the problem with Gastille is that it will be a problem card, and it will generate more problems the more Dark Rager support is going to get. Sure, Dark Rager players are going to say, well, but it's the most fun card, or this allows us the options. But there are some cards that just shouldn't exist because they are going to generate problems. Just look at other card games, like the whole issue what Yu-Gi-Oh! Had for a long time with Firewall Dragon. That card was a problem card that generates so many degeneracy. And honestly, Gastille could be the Vanguard version of that, if they are not careful with this. So right now, I think they can go the NOK Gastille route. But if they keep making these great, insane grade 3s, I think Gastille is on the chop blocks at some point. And then for Riviere, honestly, it's really hard to say what they should hit for Riviere in Premium. They could restrict the support grade 3 with Riviere, so they cannot do those insane superior right that we have with Ezel. They can maybe restrict in the lower, in the grade 2s to grade 1 lines. They can also maybe just state, if you want to run this superior right thing, they then can prohibit that you can go into the stride, that they just ban outright, limit the Riviere stride in that capacity. But they should hit something to make the deck bit less obnoxious to do it. Because if they're gonna hit Katrina, Castile, and Essel, the new Riviere is gonna be the top dog. And they should hit that as well. Basically the same that they did with the whole Nubatama hit, where they preemptively hit that deck while also hitting the other deck, so that deck won't run out of control. They should do the same. If they're gonna hit these top decks, they should also hit the Riviere build that's coming up and coming in premium at this point. But those are basically my personal picks of what should or shouldn't be hit with the upcoming ban list. But what I honestly think is gonna happen is completely different. Because what I think is gonna happen next week is that for Standard, we're going to see a Riviere Caro choice restriction. We see the unrestriction of the Sonata and Lisa Lot choice restriction. And I think that's about it for Standard. Maybe one or two things can slip in, but I think that's about it. Because I don't think they're going to see an issue with the Axel decks, especially with the upcoming support that has almost no Axel support. So I think they're going to leave it at that. And for Premium, I think the only thing they're going to hit is something in Ezel. Because Ezel has been dominating both worlds, and I think they actually think that's an issue. They might do something about Dark Regulars because it won the championship for the Japan side. But I don't think that that's enough for them to say we need to do something about Dark Regulars itself. I think the only thing that's on the chopping blocks right now for Premium is golds. But besides that, it's anybody's game. Do I think they should hit more? Yes. Do I think it's gonna happen? I'm not sure. Because we have seen too many different things from Bushiroad. They either go completely crazy with their ban list, like what happened last time, or they just do piss poor and we get no restriction at all. That could also be a thing, but I honestly don't think that that's the case, that we're going to see no changes, because that would be the worst outcome. I think not doing anything is worse than just outright neutering everything. But that's personally my opinion. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think is going to happen on the ban list next week. Because there are a lot of obnoxious decks out there. And there are enough decks out there that a lot of people have issues with for the longest of time. And wish to see dethroned of their position. So let me know in the comments down below what your suggestions are for what's going to happen next week. And I will see you guys in the next video. But definitely Tuesday, once we see the new ban list. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/Vanguard Insider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, then head over to patreon.com/Vanguard Insider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Timeleap, and I see you guys in the next one!